God. Let's go, huh? Let's go.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode number 8 of the Bolts and Colts podcast. This is Brian Latendry, and this week is going to be another solo episode because our good friend Brian Riley cannot join me this week, but we have a lot to talk about. And I don't think it'll be a super long episode, but I definitely wanted to get into the Colts game from last week and also another hugely disappointing Chargers loss. And you know, I think my tendency as a longtime, lifelong Chargers fan is to always spend the most time talking about what happened with the Chargers game. For those of you that didn't catch the games last week, maybe didn't see the scores, Chargers lost 31-30 in a divisional rivalry game to the Denver Broncos. And it was another 16-point plus lead loss. In fact, they were up 24-3 at one point in the third quarter with about 7 minutes to go in the third quarter. And they gave up, they lost 28-6 from that point on and went on to lose the game. And so the Chargers lose another heartbreaker. This is another one in a long string of games where they have given up the game by one score. This was the fourth game in a row that they have given up a 16-point lead. They won one of those 4 games against Jacksonville. They lost the other 3. This was a game, if you remember, when we were talking about what we thought the schedules were looking like for the rest of the season, the potential for each team, you know, both the Colts and the Bolts, to win games for the rest of the season, what they might look like, you know, in terms of wins and losses for the rest of the year. This was a game that the Chargers absolutely needed to win. Now, this week, they're going in to face the Raiders, a Raiders team that is better than they have been in a few years, certainly a more dynamic team than they have been in a few years. And now the Chargers are in absolute must-win mode pretty much for the rest of the season. I think I mentioned before that, in my mind, 10-6 is the worst record that you're going to be able to have in order to make the playoffs, in my mind. And so the fact that the Chargers are sitting at 5 losses already means that they have 1 loss to spend for the rest of the season. And so it is pretty much win or go home here on out. Joey Bosa is nursing a concussion. There's a good chance that he won't be playing tomorrow. Keenan Allen, it was just announced today, has an illness. They haven't said whether or not it's COVID, but there's a chance that he may not be playing tomorrow. So we're already going into that game with some big question marks on the offensive side and the defensive side, in addition to all the injuries that they have dealt with all season long. So they're in for a dogfight in tomorrow's game. And this game this past week with the Broncos was one that they just really could not lose. And they went and they lost it again. Let's talk about some of the stats from that game. As I mentioned, 7 minutes and 38 seconds left in the third quarter. They go up 24-3. They were outscored 28-6 the rest of that game. We're looking at quarterback stats. I'm not even going to talk about Herbert because he had a couple of interceptions, but again, he was balling in that game. He was putting points up on the board. They were in the driver's seat of that game, and the offense did what they needed to do in that game. Drew Lock of the Denver Broncos went 26 of 41 for 248 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. That is the most attempts, completions, yards, and touchdowns that he has had in a game this season. So he basically, in really a quarter and a half, unloaded on the Chargers and had his best game of the year. At the time that the Chargers were up 24-3 in that game, they had a 99.3% win probability at that point. The Denver Broncos had a 0.7% chance of coming back and winning that game. Chargers are the first team in NFL history to blow a lead of at least 16 points in 4 straight games. In the first half of games this season, the Chargers are allowing a league-low 137 yards and have outscored teams 101-72. So in the first half of games this season, the Chargers are among the best teams in the league. After halftime, they are allowing 226 yards, third worst in the league, while being outscored 113-78. I mean, we talked about this before when talking about the Chargers, but the second half collapses for this team are unbelievable at this point. They're consistently a bad defense in the second half of football games. And that is just baffling. I mean, is it a conditioning thing? I don't think so. Is it an injury thing? Sure. The injuries absolutely play into the fact that they don't have the depth to, especially in the secondary, to be out on the field for long stretches at a time. But this is a coaching issue. For you to completely collapse time and time and time again in the third and fourth quarters of games, that is a coaching issue. And we're seeing it again. And there was a lot of calls this week for Gus Bradley to be fired. There was a lot of calls for Anthony Lynn to be fired. The Anthony Lynn stuff has been going on since the Chargers have struggled throughout the season. And I usually kind of dismiss that. I'm definitely a fan of Anthony Lynn. But to me, the accountability starts with the head coach. And for the Chargers to be in this situation continually, I look at the head coach. Do changes need to be made elsewhere in terms of coordinators? Absolutely. But it starts and ends with the coach. And I'm really shocked that he hasn't been able to turn this culture of losing around with this team and the talent that they have. They're one of the most talented teams in the league. And it just doesn't show up in the final score. Might show up in individual stats. I mean, again, Herbert is just playing amazing. Through 6 games, Herbert has over 1,800 yards, 15 touchdowns, 5 interceptions for a 67% completion rate and a 104.5 quarterback rating, which is 8th in the league. He's been playing amazing. A lot of great individual performances, but putting it together as a team and winning the game, just not happening. I don't know what else to say about this game. We're at a point now where the same things keep happening to this team. They're running out of opportunities to stop the bleeding, and they absolutely have to turn it around this week against the Raiders, or the season is pretty much over. If they lose to the Raiders, they are out of losses for the rest of the year. And I just don't think they're going to be able to win out after that. So they have to stop the bleeding this week against the Raiders. If they do, they'll be 3-5, still a long shot in the division, and still have some semblance of playoff hopes alive. But if they lose to the Raiders this week, it's pretty much done for the season. One bright spot this week, I thought, other than Herbert, who continued to play well, obviously Keenan Allen had a big day. Love to see the chemistry between Keenan Allen and Herbert developing. Love to see him getting the ball more. Troymaine Pope, 10 rushes for 67 yards, and he kind of ate up a lot of the carries that would have went to Josh Kelly. And when he was in the game, he just looked much more dynamic than Josh Kelly. And I love Josh Kelly. I think Josh Kelly was a great draft pick. I've liked what he's done so far this year. When Eckler went down, he's shown flashes of potentially maybe being a number 1 guy. But lately, to me, and part of it is the run blocking hasn't always been that great, he's taken a long time to hit the hole. He just doesn't seem as dynamic as I thought he looked earlier in the season. Troymaine Pope looked dynamic the other day. He was hitting the hole. He was running aggressive. He was a real bright spot. But it'll be interesting to see if he's going to be eating up any carries for Josh Kelly, or if Josh Kelly took that as kind of a wake-up call and is really going to come out and play hard this week. So anyways, enough about the Chargers. Another just absolutely heartbreaking loss. I'm starting to get numb to them. Granted, I've had 40 plus years of experience getting used to the Chargers losing, but it's amazing to me that they can still surprise me with ways to lose a game, especially when they have been leading. By the way, those sirens and everything else are on my end. I live in the city, so there's your ambiance for you. Let's go over to the Colts game, because the Colts, I don't think we've been talking about enough on this show. We've spent a lot of energy talking about the Chargers. We've spent a lot of energy talking about Justin Herbert. But when you look at this Colts game this past week, and they beat the Lions 41-21, and it really wasn't even that close. This was pretty much a dismantling of the Lions by the Colts this week on both sides of the ball and on special teams. They just looked like a really, really balanced team. Phillip Rivers' line in this game, 23 of 33 for 262 yards and 3 touchdowns, no turnovers. The defense in this game, 5 sacks, 1 interception, which was a pick 6, and a fumble recovery. Just looked aggressive, looked dominant, were hitting hard. And that was one thing that kind of struck me too when I was looking at the Colts game and I was looking at the Chargers game. When I was watching this Colts game, the defense was, and granted Darius Leonard being back absolutely helped that, but just physical, really smacking guys, really hammering guys, just brutal hits all around by the defense all day long. That's not something I see with the Chargers. With the Chargers, their defense feels soft. They don't feel aggressive. Even when they're getting sacks, they're not hard-hitting sacks. Even when they're tackling guys for losses, they're not hard-hitting. You know, you might get a handful of those a game. I felt like in the Colts game, that team was flying around, knocking people over, punching people in the mouth, just hard defense, which puts the fear into the offense that anytime they have the ball in their hands, there's a truck coming their way. And that was good to see. We've talked about how the Colts defense has been a little Jekyll and Hyde this year. But man, when they're aggressive, and especially when they get a team down and they know that team has to pass to catch up and they can just sort of pin their ears back and really go after the quarterback, they look good. And it was a joy to watch that defense just knocking people around. On the offensive side of the ball, I mean, again, Phillip Rivers, 262, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. This is what you're going to get from Phillip Rivers. You're going to get games like this, and then you're going to get games where he throws a pick or two. But he's never going to stop slinging, and he continues to put the Colts in positions to score. In this game, again, there was a lot of situations where guys dropped balls that were catchable, or they would have even been in a better position a lot of those times. Now, granted, he also had some errant throws, but overall, I mean, every week it feels like he's getting more and more command of that offense, and a lot of different guys continue to step up. I think at one point he had, pretty early in the game, he had hit 10 different receivers. We again see T.Y. Hilton not being prominent in this offense, and I still don't have an answer for why. There was actually a couple times that T.Y. made good blocks on run plays. But for whatever reason, him and Phillip just haven't been connecting on a regular basis. I don't know if it's a play calling thing or what, but he's just not a dominant factor in that offense. But the ball is moving around, and it's moving around to a lot of different receivers. Mo Alley Cox caught a couple of great balls this week, and I almost felt like in watching him and Phillip that they're developing a chemistry, that there's something there that they can continue to build on. The Colts are looking pretty good from the tight end spot. The run blocking wasn't great, but the pass blocking was good enough for Phillip to have a big day. And again, not being a super mobile quarterback, one thing he does, and I don't think he gets enough credit for, is climbs the pocket. And so while he's not going to be running around the field and picking up first downs for you a lot of the time, he can move around, he can buy time, and he just looked good, man. And again, being a huge Phillip Rivers fan, like I feel like the overreaction to his struggles, and anytime he throws a pick, is just like so over the top, because that was the knock on him. And of course, he had a down season last year. But give this guy some respect. And that's not to say he's not going to throw more interceptions before the end of the season. He's going to. He's right now, through 7 games, he has just over 1,800 yards. He's got 10 TDs, 6 interceptions, 69.7 completion percentage, and a 97.3 QB rating, which is good for 15th, I think. So he's right in the middle of the pack in terms of his rating. And I think that's with a couple of bad games that kind of overshadowed the good that he's done. So I think if the line continues to pass block well, he's going to continue to have a good season. And I feel like, them being 5-2 at this point, that's what you're going to get out of Phillip Rivers. If this team continues to play that way, they're going to continue to have this level of success. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about the matchups for this week. We talked about the Raiders and the Chargers for a second, but just kind of overall, another bright spot, I think, for the Colts this week was Jordan Wilkins, who ran the ball 20 times for 89 yards and a touchdown. Jonathan Taylor only had 11 carries to the 20 that Wilkins had in this game, and it kind of made me think a lot about Troy Pope and Josh Kelly of the Chargers, because what I was seeing from Jonathan Taylor is kind of similar to what I was seeing from Josh Kelly, which is just that they weren't getting to the hole fast enough. They weren't running aggressively enough or putting themselves, they're good downhill runners, but they weren't getting to that spot where they could really leverage their strength. And so there were other guys that outshined them. Jordan Wilkins ran the ball aggressively. He hit the holes fast. There was a couple plays where he just bulldozed guys and moved that line and got extra yards when he had already been stopped. And he was just a step quicker than everybody else out there. Every time he touched the ball, there was like a shot of electricity. And I felt the same thing with Troy Pope. And so it's just an interesting sort of dynamic to watch with these backs, right? Especially when you have sort of a running back by committee approach, like who's hot on any given day, who's running with more purpose, who's running more aggressively. And I think you're going to see days where Josh Kelly steps up and has a better day and gets more touches. Same thing, Jonathan Taylor. I think you're going to see this kind of ebb and flow of these backs over the course of the season. And when you have at least a couple of good backs in the backfield, you can afford to do that. But to me, when you see one back having a lot more success than the other one, it means that the blocking is decent enough, right? That there's opportunities there. Are these guys making the adjustments they need to make in order to take advantage of those opportunities? And so hopefully they're learning from one another. Again, like I said, huge fan of Josh Kelly. I hope that he has a good bounce back week this week. And Jonathan Taylor, too, I think has a huge upside as well. So, but interesting that I saw some kind of parallels there. So let's talk about the game that the Colts have coming up this week, which is the Ravens. Now, I didn't mention the line in the Chargers-Raiders game, but when I saw it, it was even. So, which is wild to me because I feel like the Raiders have actually been a better team in terms of consistency this year. Although, because of the penalties that they have around COVID, I didn't see their injury report, they're not coming into that game at full strength. So the Chargers, with their offensive capability, certainly have an opportunity to put points up against the Raiders and win that game. That's not far-fetched at all. And so them being even seems right to me. The Ravens and the Colts are favored by 1 the last time I saw the line, which I thought was really interesting. Now, granted, the Colts are at home for this game, but that Ravens team is good. And this is going to be a huge test for the defense of the Colts and the offense of the Colts. Phillip Rivers is going to see pressure on offense. He's going to have to make good decisions or they will punish his mistakes in this game. This could be a game where Phillip Rivers either silences all the critics or some of those bad habits creep up because he will be under pressure. Who is going to be his Mr. Reliable this week? In some ways, I thought it was Hines last week, who had a fantastic game for the Colts. Who's it going to be this week? Is Mo Alley Cox going to step up and make some clutch catches this week? Is T.Y. Hilton going to become that guy this week? Who's going to be Mr. Reliable for Phillip Rivers? He's going to need that because they're definitely going to be in some 3rd and long situations, and they're going to have to convert. And so, to me, this is the biggest test that the Colts have seen so far this year, because they're going to be tested equally on both sides of the ball. I'm really looking forward to see how they respond to that. I think at this point, with the way they're playing, if they play the way they played last week, they can easily beat the Ravens. But they're going to have to play a complete game on both sides of the ball. That's going to be a tall order, because they haven't always been consistent. When one side of the field is on, the other one's been off a little bit. Last week, they kind of put everything together, and they really took care of the Lions. This week, they're playing the Ravens. They're going to really need to have a good game plan and go in there and be very consistent. I feel good about their ability to do that, but the Ravens can certainly disrupt that game plan. So that to me is like game of the week material right there to watch. The Raiders-Chargers is always a fun game because those two teams hate each other. And so I expect that to be a slugfest. To me, that's an offensive game. Like I wouldn't be surprised if the Raiders-Chargers game was, 38-35, 41-38, something like that. That wouldn't surprise me at all. The Ravens-Colts game, I could see that being a lower scoring game, but who's to say? I mean, you've got Lamar Jackson on one side of the field. You've got a pretty well-oiled Colts offense on the other side of the field that's been just put up 41 points, or 34, not counting the defensive touchdown, but putting up over 30 points a game. Like, this is going to be a battle. So 2 great games this week. Not a must-win for the Colts, but a nice barometer of where they're at so far and where their sort of playoff aspirations are. For the Chargers, it's an absolutely critical must-win game. And so different circumstances for each of those teams going into this week, but games that really are a test for both teams. 1 for the Chargers to keep their season alive, 2 for the Colts to show that they are legit. That 5-2 is just the beginning for them, and they are to be taken seriously as contenders in the AFC in the second half of the season. So it's going to be a really interesting week. Last week was interesting for bad reasons for me, for the Chargers, as usual, but looking forward for the Chargers to bounce back this week. I know they'll bring a lot of energy versus the Raiders. I just hope they can close out in the fourth quarter. And the Colts, I just want them to keep playing the way they're playing, and I think they will acquit themselves well against the Ravens. So that's really all I have this week. Obviously, if it was the two of us, we probably would have been babbling on a little bit more. Probably would have got into the quarterback stuff a little bit more. But for me, like for the Chargers right now, it's just that they got to learn how to close. For the Colts, they seem to be finding their stride. They got to keep it going. And I think that is going to wrap up this episode of the Bolts and Colts podcast. So next week, hopefully, I will have Brian back and we can dive into a little bit more of, I'd like to talk to him a little bit about what he thinks of the Chargers coaching situation and stuff like that. Because obviously I'm biased, but just from an objective observer's sort of third-party view, I would love to hear his thoughts on, do you make a change at this point in the season? What happens if the Chargers lose against the Raiders and then they're 2-6? Do we see them throw in the towel at that point? Do they make some coaching changes, or do you let the season play out because you were, sort of forced into starting your rookie? You've got a lot of injuries on the team. Do you play it out for the rest of the year and evaluate at the end of the year? That would be what I think the Chargers do. Although I think if they lose through another epic collapse in the fourth quarter, in the second half, whatever, I could see a change being made there. But I think only if it's another epic collapse. If they're playing competitive football and they're just not winning, I think that waits till the end of the season. But I think if they don't end up with a winning record and turn this thing around this season, I do feel like Anthony Lynn will not be the head coach next year. But I would like him to turn it around because I like him, and I like the attitude that he's brought to the team and the discipline he's brought to the team, which is why it's so baffling that it hasn't translated into them closing out games. But anyways, we could talk to Brian more about that next week. That is going to wrap up this episode of the Bolts and Colts podcast. Thank you for listening. And again, if you are a fan of the Chargers or you're a fan of the Colts, throw us a comment. Let us know where you think the teams are at this point in the season, what you think the main stories are, and what you want to see us talk about. And we'll talk to you next week.